Chapter 1. The Old House on the Dirt Hill. You can only look forward to a South Dakota winter if, as with childbirth, remodeling a house, or writing a novel, you're able to forget how bad it was the last time. That's from Dan O'Brien in his book Buffalo for the Broken Heart, Restoring Life to a Black Hills Ranch. It's like this in May. Ethan had a look that perpetually bordered on surprise. He was somewhere in that gray area of maturity, balancing in the middle of a man's 20s. He wore the thick-rimmed black glasses all the trendies did, but he didn't actually have a prescription. They were lensless frames. That should say a lot about Ethan. He was a fairly average, late-stage Generation Z kid, right down to the Technicolor hair, which was thankfully only bleached, and the surprised expression. Still, that surprise was somewhat justified this time, as he had become accustomed to California. Encountering South Dakota's Black Hills in May, he did not expect to see snow. "I don't know if I'm up for this," he muttered. He turned the heat up in his car, a Chevy Spark made to appear as though it were a smart car, though it was nothing of the kind. It sat forward, but looked like you'd lose it if you forgot which pair of pants you left it in. A motivated enough person could literally fit the thing in the bed of an average-sized pickup truck. A fine car for South California, perhaps. In South Dakota, Ethan would need snow tires soon. Still, he had time. He had chosen the right month to move to Trail Limestone. He had not chosen the right moment to take his eyes off the road so he could adjust the heat, and nearly swerved into a mule deer that was unimpressed by his micro machine as it casually lumbered up the hill. He barely managed to regain his lane quick enough to miss being creamed by a semi. "This place hits different," he breathed. "Bet." And Ethan wasn't wrong. Before the gold rush, the natives considered the Black Hills mystical, sacred ground where magical things hardly understood by man were the norm rather than the exception. By the gold rush of the late 1800s, numerous mining operations had come and gone. Trail was a little town, one that had become the center of a modern scientific facility, the Stanford Ancillary Neutrino Division, or SAND for short. SAND existed where an old mineral mine once was. It had waned in profitability until it closed in the early 2000s. The town of Trail, South Dakota, would have continued to implode after this, operating chiefly as a bedroom community for workers at the casinos in adjacent Limestone, a sister city. However, burgeoning research into dark matter, neutrinos, and other areas of particle physics required that such subterranean infrastructure as the vacant mines, well, it was perfect for high-level experimentation. So it was the sand came. Billions of dollars transformed dead passageways of excavated caves into laboratories that drew hundreds of students from universities around the world, where they acted in a certain capacity as glorified interns for the science teams actually spending investor money. Little to no direct return came from investment in the facility, but it did generate a heap of economy for the sleepy mountain town of Trail, helping the community to at once maintain a veneer of modernity and progressive class. To Ethan, this seemed like a fine opportunity to start over, and for several reasons. He'd seen the cities go mad in 2020. He tried to tough it out through the end of that year, but it became too much. True, one tends to conform to the culture and society within which one is situated. Ethan worked in tech, and tech was on the bleeding edge of modern culture. So when the COVID-19 lockdowns hit, South California changed overnight. The problem Ethan had was a degree of intellectual honesty. He'd adopted much of the cultural zeitgeist of the time into his own identity, but working in technology enabled him to have a passing familiarity with mathematics, from which was rooted an understanding of trends and statistics. Ethan could crunch numbers all in his head, hardly any difficulty, and he saw where the lies were in the COVID-19 narrative. This was only a small step, though. He had no idea how deep the rabbit hole ultimately went. The truth wasn't something he could really discuss with the community that slaved him in San Francisco, not safely. It was like being Eastern Orthodox in Moscow during the Soviet reign. You kept that to yourself. Still, he had seen enough to realize something was rotten in the state of Denmark, as it were, even if his own Orange Man Bad crowd were having a field day. If you were there, you remember wild parties took place in the Bay Area during lockdown. Jazz bands on the Titanic. Despite it all, Ethan thought he found a way out. With the advent of the crisis, work from home decentralization flourished across the world. Very soon everybody worked from home, and Ethan reasoned, why should he spend $2,000 or more a month on rent to share a room with half a dozen strung out activists? Why should he literally live off beans in San Francisco? He could work from home, and he could do that anywhere. The city had a fine nightlife, beautiful scenery, lots of history, trending social pulse, but the traffic was terrible. The crime was insane. The prices were always rising, and if you didn't watch where you walked on sidewalks, you'd step right into some junkie's runny excrement. Only a few years back, he'd been able to afford his own single unit. Before he left, he had to carefully strip everything out of his car and roll the windows down to avoid a break-in whenever he parked. Meanwhile, he shared a room with literally half a dozen different people he didn't even know. The room had one bathroom and was less than 1,000 square feet. The kicker? Most of Ethan's friends were envious of his situation. That level of change hit from 2015 to 2021. It was enough. Not all change is good change, a lesson Ethan was fast learning, so he searched. And eventually, the relatively unknown but gently trending Trail Livestone came across his path. The problem was, he was about a year late. It had looked in 2019 or even 2020. If he'd looked then, he would have found numerous underpriced properties and apartments. But Ethan came to the community in early 21, by which time it had really begun to thrive. Properties had doubled in value from the time they doubled before, and reasonable apartments scarce. Though Ethan had work which would reliably provide him $4,000 a month. How long he could maintain that work overall was a serious question. Ethan worked in the private sector. Small companies were folding quick, faster than a single mom wrapping silverware on Christmas Eve at the back end of a Hooters shift, you might say. Looking at Trail Livestone, Ethan thought he might establish tech services locally, which would require finding somewhere to live for 6 months to a year, saving as much money as he could, and preparing for the end of his remote income. There was a global tech convention that took place annually in Livestone proper. Previously, Reno and Las Vegas had hosted such events, but after the lockdown, many tech groups found more free areas for their conventions. Now, in Livestone, there was a moderately sized tech convention every year. Ethan thought he might secure his future by making a good impression at this convention when the time was right. It could be this year, could be next year. Ethan figured if he played his cards right, he might get more than one shot. Somebody had to configure the convention's networks, didn't they? It became imperative he find somewhere to float until he could make a move. So he scoured the internet, but was baffled to find the only units available were rental Airbnb rooms almost as expensive as what he'd escaped in San Francisco, or homes in the vicinity of $150,000. Maybe that was affordable compared to San Francisco, but Ethan did not have down payment capital. Even so, he didn't give up and found a motel in the area, turning every rock over he could find, seeking a solid rent option. He'd been at the cheap motel a week before he found a unit. Wasn't listed online, but in some print periodical for cars called Anybody's Autos. The magazines were neatly stacked in a rack near the sliding doors of a convenience store in the hotel parking lot. Picking one up on whim, he found a section with classified advertisements. There was a small text ad soliciting a room in a house 4 miles away, just about in the center of Trail. Ethan was now driving to see this unit. He'd spoken briefly, very briefly, to the landlord over the phone. The conversation went like this. Hello? Yes. A hard but clear voice. Ethan couldn't place the age. It sounded not robotic, almost too perfect. The word had been enunciated with precise neutrality, and that characterized every short word out the man's mouth. Ethan blinked. I'm looking? I want to look at a room you have for rent? To move in. I want to look at the room first. I'm here now. Where? 303 North Granite Lane. Okay, I can come now. Yes. And the line went dead. Now, as he drove up the hill from the hotel in Livestone, the snow was falling. Ethan was not familiar with snow. He'd seen it as a youngster in the Midwest, but that was over a decade ago. He'd never driven in it. He followed the GPS on a winding hill that seemed to go straight up, every bit as steep as anything he remembered in San Francisco. The snow had not begun to stick, but it made him nervous all the same. Just when he thought the hill was over, he started to see houses on either side and suddenly realized they stretched up those midget mountains like irregular multicolored teeth. A silo from the old mine had a cylindrical beam containing a conveyor belt jutting from its side. The beam stretched horizontally across the road. Ethan couldn't help but follow with his eyes where it crossed. It disappeared into the darkness where the remains of the first mine, the one leaving a massive quarry pit beside the town of Trail, lay dormant. Abruptly, Ethan crested the incline and realized he was already in the town of Trail. It had one main street stretching north to south. That street was studded with buildings built 100 years ago, and sometimes even before that. They were all aesthetically consistent with the time of their creation. The town was surrounded in tree-covered hills like rolling deep green blankets. Between the pines were endless little houses that were coming aglow in the early evening. The GPS indicator on his vehicle told him to turn right, so he did, suddenly going down a steep incline limned in red brick buildings that looked distinctly antiquated. The GPS indicated the house was directly ahead. The hill led out to a flat area, then a new hill began that was similarly straight up. It leveled off for a moment until suddenly an even more steep dirt pathway faded high into the early evening twilight. The pathway was thick with buildings on either side, and it was clear there was pavement beyond where it ended. Ethan couldn't see it, but only one of the units on that street actually faced the dirt pathway as though it were a proper street rather than some neglected alley. The rest had entrances in paved areas. Ethan tried to drive the little car up the path, but could only make it about 10 feet before the vehicle's lawnmower-sized four-cylinder engine said no in its native RPM dialect. Beginning to sweat, Ethan carefully backed the vehicle down a little intersection that was made of two one-ways, the one road down which he was reversing and the one that intersected it heading south to north. Ethan carefully eased the vehicle down in the muddy, slowly widening dirt, then backed into the one-way facing the right direction, but allowing his car to drift the wrong direction. In his rearview mirror, he could see a small parking spot where the road sloped toward a retaining wall, as lacking in repair as the property it hemmed in. He parked, pulled a stocking cap around his head, and exited the vehicle, locking it with the button on his key fob out of habit. He had gray slacks, a dark sweater, and a blue jean jacket with a variety of rock buttons pinned to it. The snow had left the paved ground more wet than anything else, but on the dirt hill where his little car had failed, it transformed the rocky path into a conglomeration of slush and mud. Ethan pulled out his phone again and looked at the address. It was up the hill, all right, about 100 feet away as the phone indicated. He began up the steep, muddy incline, glad he was wearing Velcro fasteners on his shoes rather than sneakers with laces that would get easily soiled. The muddy snow kept slipping and the hill was steep. Very soon he could feel his thighs burning and was out of breath. As he came closer, he saw a house quite old but recently painted, probably by somebody who was colorblind. The pillars were green, the same sort of green. They had red trim around them, candy apple red, and the majority of the house was a gaudy blue color broken with purple trim. There was a rundown yard that appeared as though at one time someone had tried to take care of it but had lost the will to go on. It wasn't cluttered or anything, just bare. A metal shed with a collapsed roof rested on the southeast corner, behind which was a tree and several additional houses. The homes were tightly packed in this area. That reminded him of San Francisco a little. There was a small deck wrapping around the house, hosting the green pillars, which held up an overhang that wasn't part of the building's primary infrastructure. Below the deck, facing down the hill, was a wide front area where trim and siding were falling apart. This likely hemmed in the foundation. Coming from the front door, a bit like a notched tongue, were broken concrete stairs sandwiched between schizophrenic grasses fighting through a veil of snow. The front door faced northward to the muddy alley. As Ethan came up the stairs, he saw a surprisingly level rectangle of painted concrete in front of the door, which led to a wood decking that continued around the side of the house as he'd seen from the hill. The old bungalow had a square appearance, an old-style door, and a chimney in the middle of its sloping pyramidal roof that was gently belching smoke. Were those solar panels up there? The front door was painted to match the poorly chosen blue of the rest of the home. Ethan felt a sudden wave of fear. Also, he was still having trouble breathing after scaling the hill. The place looked ancient, out of another century even. While still exhaling from the climb, Ethan checked his phone again. The app still said he was at the right place. He swallowed, wiped his shoes in the wet snowy grass to get the mud off them, and was about to knock on the door when it opened violently. A man leveled a 1,000-yard stare at Ethan from inside the strangely colored house, and he froze. Behind the stare was a sparsely wrinkled face under graying hair that was 3 or 4 times longer than it should have been, and a massive salt and pepper beard. The man was 6 feet if he were an inch, and could have been 40 or 70. The moment passed, and the owner of the home said, "The room, this way," in a perfectly neutral, gruff, non-dialect. "I'm Ethan," said Ethan, and extended his hand, but the older gentleman had already turned into the house and was holding the door for him. "Carl." "Hey, Carl, need me to lose my shoes?" Carl glanced at Ethan's feet where they dripped on a floor mat atop wooden slats. "Yes." And he closed the door behind. Up the dirt hill, past one more little neighborhood of houses built in a time of eloquent Victorian architecture long forgotten through most of the country, on the side of the highest hill and trail, a silent man pulled back from a heavy telephoto lens mounted on a tripod against the inside window of an SUV. The lens was trained on the house in the middle of the only unpaved street and trail, specifically the front door where Ethan had just entered the unfortunately painted old cottage. The silent man was seated alone in the passenger seat of his black SUV. He had parked in such a way that he was nestled against trees so the vehicle would become invisible as twilight bled to darkness. The man was in his 30s, fit, with sandy hair, a clean-shaven Roman face, and clothing of a style designed for flexibility or formality should the occasion demand. He exhaled, picked up a smartphone, and tapped out, "There's a renter." He read what he had typed and hesitated for the ghost of a second, and then hit send.